There is something about America in the 1960s that captures a moment of profound transformation. The optimism of the early years, the upheaval that followed, the sense that the country was reinventing itself in real time. If someone lived through it, they know exactly what made that decade so unforgettable. This was a time when America was reaching for the moon and grappling with its conscience on Earth. President Kennedy promised a new frontier. The civil rights movement was changing the nation's soul. The Beatles arrived and changed music forever. Television was becoming the center of American family life. This was the decade that gave us the space race, Motown, the Vietnam War on the evening news, and suburbs spreading across the American landscape like never before. Post-war prosperity was at its peak, but old certainties were beginning to crack. Living through the 1960s meant witnessing history unfold at a dizzying pace. Let's walk through what daily life actually felt like during that transformative decade. Some of this might bring back memories. Some of it might explain why the 1960s remained so present in American consciousness. Let's step into that world. Homes in 1960s America had a distinctive look that anyone who lived through the era would recognize instantly. The decade began with the clean lines of mid-century modern design still dominant. Furniture had tapered legs. Colors were bold but controlled. Turquoise, coral, and mustard yellow appeared on sofas and kitchen appliances. The ranch house was the dominant style of American housing. These single-story homes spread across the suburbs, each with a front lawn, a backyard, and an attached garage. They were designed for the automobile age, set back from the street with driveways leading to carports or garages. The open floor plan was becoming popular, with living rooms flowing into dining areas. Inside these homes, wall-to-wall carpeting was replacing area rugs. Wood paneling appeared in dens and basement recreation rooms. The living room was arranged around the television set, which was still a large piece of furniture in a wooden cabinet. By the mid-1960s, color television was arriving in American homes, though it remained expensive. Families would gather to watch programs in color for the first time, marveling at how different everything looked. The kitchen was the domain of the American housewife, and it was filled with modern conveniences. Electric ranges had replaced many gas stoves. Refrigerators were large and often came in colors like avocado green or harvest gold by the late 1960s. The kitchen table with chrome legs and a formica top was where families ate breakfast and children did homework. Appliances that seem basic today were still relatively new. Automatic dishwashers were becoming more common but were far from universal. Clothes dryers meant laundry no longer had to hang on lines outside. The garbage disposal seemed almost miraculous. These conveniences promised to make housework easier, though the standards for cleanliness and meal preparation remained demanding. The telephone was attached to the wall in the kitchen, with a long curly cord that allowed some movement. Party lines still existed in some areas, meaning neighbors shared the same line and could potentially listen in. Long-distance calls were expensive and reserved for special occasions. When the phone rang, someone had to be home to answer it. There was no way to know who was calling until you picked up. The suburbs that spread across America in the 1960s represented a particular vision of the good life. Levittown had shown what was possible in the late 1940s, and developers had refined the model. New subdivisions appeared on former farmland outside every major city. These communities promised safety, good schools, and neighbors who looked and lived much like you did. Suburban life revolved around the family and the automobile. Mothers drove children to school, to Little League practice, and to piano lessons. Station wagons became the family vehicle of choice, with room for children, groceries, and the family dog. The two-car garage was becoming standard for families who could afford it. Children in the suburbs had a freedom that seems remarkable today. They played outside until the streetlights came on. They rode bicycles for miles without adult supervision. Neighborhoods were filled with children, and informal games of baseball or tag would form spontaneously in backyards and on quiet streets. The car culture that had been building since the 1950s reached new heights in the 1960s. American automobiles were enormous, with tail fins that were slowly shrinking from the excesses of the late 1950s. Chevrolet, Ford, and Chrysler dominated the roads. These cars had powerful V8 engines, bench seats that could fit 3 people across, and chrome details everywhere. Muscle cars emerged as icons of the decade. The Ford Mustang debuted in 1964 and became an instant sensation. The Pontiac GTO, the Chevrolet Camaro, and the Dodge Charger followed. Young men dreamed of these cars. The rumble of a big engine became the sound of American power and freedom. Gas was cheap, often around 30 cents a gallon. Nobody worried about fuel efficiency. Cars got maybe 10 or 12 miles per gallon, and that was fine. The interstate highway system that Eisenhower had begun was expanding rapidly, making it possible to drive across the country on modern roads. Family road trips were an American ritual. Families would pile into the station wagon and drive to the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, or Disneyland. Motels with neon signs lined the highways. Howard Johnson's restaurants with their orange roofs offered familiar food at predictable prices. Children would count license plates from different states, play car games, and fight with siblings in the back seat. Before we continue with the culture and changes that define this era, if you are enjoying this look back at how American families really lived and want to explore more decades and places, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories about how Americans built the lives we know today. Television transformed American family life in the 1960s more than any other technology. By 1960, most American homes had at least one television set. Families gathered in the living room each evening to watch together. The 3 major networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, provided almost all programming. The shows of the early 1960s reflected an idealized vision of American life. Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, and The Donna Reed Show depicted perfect families in perfect homes, solving minor problems with wisdom and humor. These sitcoms showed a world where fathers went to work in suits, mothers wore pearls while vacuuming, and children's biggest worries were playground disputes. Westerns dominated prime time. Gunsmoke, Bonanza, and The Virginian drew millions of viewers each week. These shows presented a simple moral universe where good guys wore white hats and justice always prevailed. The American frontier, real or imagined, remained central to the national mythology. The news changed everything. Walter Cronkite became the most trusted man in America, delivering the CBS Evening News each night. When President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963, Americans experienced the tragedy together through television. For 4 days, the nation watched coverage of the aftermath, the funeral, and the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald on live television. It was a shared national trauma experienced through the screen. The civil rights movement came into American living rooms through television. The images of peaceful protesters being attacked with fire hoses and police dogs in Birmingham shocked white Americans who had been able to ignore segregation. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches reached audiences far beyond those who could attend in person. The March on Washington in 1963 was a television event as much as a physical gathering. Vietnam became the first television war. Each evening, footage from the conflict appeared on the news. American families ate dinner while watching combat, casualties, and body counts. The disconnect between official optimism and what people could see with their own eyes contributed to growing doubts about the war. By the late 1960s, television programming was changing. Shows like the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour pushed boundaries with political humor. Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In brought counterculture sensibilities to prime time. The variety show format allowed for experimentation that the networks had previously avoided. Music in the 1960s was revolutionary in ways that still resonate. The decade began with the clean-cut sounds of early rock and roll, Motown girl groups, and folk music. By its end, everything had changed. The Beatles arrived in February 1964, and American popular music was never the same. Their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show drew 73 million viewers. Beatlemania swept the country. Teenage girls screamed. Teenage boys grew their hair longer. Parents worried about what it all meant. The British invasion brought wave after wave of bands. The Rolling Stones offered a rougher alternative to the Beatles. The Who, the Kinks, and dozens of others followed. American rock and roll, which had invented the form, suddenly seemed old-fashioned. Motown provided the soundtrack for much of the decade. Based in Detroit, the label produced hit after hit with the Supremes, the Temptations, Marvin Gaye, and Stevie Wonder. This was Black American music that crossed over to white audiences in unprecedented ways. The Motown sound was polished, sophisticated, and irresistible. Folk music carried political messages. Bob Dylan emerged from the Greenwich Village scene to become the voice of a generation. Even as he resisted that label, Joan Baez, Peter, Paul, and Mary, and others sang about civil rights, peace, and social justice. The folk revival connected young Americans to traditions while pushing them toward activism. By the late 1960s, rock had become psychedelic. The Summer of Love in 1967 brought the San Francisco sound to national attention. Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, and Janis Joplin represented something new. Woodstock in 1969 became the defining moment when 400,000 young people gathered on a farm in New York for 3 days of music and mud. Teenagers bought records at department stores or local record shops. The 45 RPM single was how most people purchased music, though albums were becoming more important as artists created works meant to be heard as complete statements. Transistor radios allowed teenagers to listen anywhere, taking their music with them. Food in the 1960s in America reflected both tradition and the embrace of convenience. The American housewife was expected to put a hot meal on the table every evening, but she had new tools to help her. Processed foods filled supermarket shelves with promises of easier cooking. Casseroles were the workhorses of American home cooking. Tuna noodle casserole, green bean casserole with canned mushroom soup, and countless variations appeared on dinner tables across the country. These dishes were economical, could be prepared ahead of time, and fed a family with minimal last-minute effort. Jell-O appeared at almost every occasion. Molded salads with suspended fruit or vegetables were considered elegant. Lime Jell-O with cottage cheese and pineapple was served at potlucks and family gatherings. The wiggling, colorful desserts seemed modern and festive. TV dinners, introduced in the 1950s, became more sophisticated. Swanson and other brands offered complete meals in aluminum trays that could be heated in the oven. Eating while watching television became acceptable, at least on some occasions. The TV tray, a folding stand that held a plate at the perfect height for viewing, became a common household item. Backyard barbecues were summer rituals. Fathers presided over charcoal grills, cooking hamburgers and hot dogs. The Weber kettle grill, introduced in the 1950s, was becoming the standard. Neighbors gathered for cookouts that extended into the evening. Shopping in the 1960s meant going to stores in person. The Sears catalog remained important, especially for families in rural areas, but most Americans did their shopping at local stores, downtown department stores, or the new shopping centers appearing in the suburbs. Department stores like Macy's, Gimbel's, and local chains were destinations. Families would dress up to go shopping downtown. The stores had multiple floors, each dedicated to different merchandise. Elevators had operators who announced each floor. The service was personal, with salespeople who knew their merchandise and their customers. Shopping centers and malls were multiplying. The enclosed mall was still relatively new, and it seemed almost magical. Climate-controlled, with multiple stores under one roof, the mall offered convenience that downtown shopping districts could not match. The parking lot was free and plentiful. Five and dime stores like Woolworth's remained popular. These stores sold everything from school supplies to toys to candy. The lunch counter at Woolworth's offered sandwiches and milkshakes. Children would spend their allowance on small toys and comic books. Supermarkets were replacing the corner grocery store. A&P, Kroger, Safeway, and regional chains offered wider selection and lower prices than small grocers could match. The supermarket offered everything under one roof, from meat to produce to canned goods to household supplies. The 1960s brought challenges that tested American families. The Cold War cast a shadow over daily life. Children practiced duck and cover drills in school, hiding under desks in case of a nuclear attack. Families debated whether to build fallout shelters in their backyards. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, and Americans waited anxiously for news. The Vietnam War divided families. As the decade progressed and casualties mounted, dinner table conversations became heated. Fathers who had served in World War II often could not understand sons who questioned the war. The generation gap became a defining feature of American life. The assassinations traumatized the nation. Those deaths included President Kennedy in 1963, Malcolm X in 1965, and Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy in 1968. Each death seemed to take something away from the national sense of possibility. The optimism of the early 1960s gave way to grief and anger. The civil rights struggle forced Americans to confront injustice that many had preferred to ignore. The legal victories, from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, changed the law. Changing hearts and minds was slower and harder. Riots in Watts, Detroit, and Newark revealed anger that legal changes alone could not address. What defined the 1960s for American families was change itself. The decade began with confident prosperity and ended with uncertainty and division. The optimism of the Kennedy years gave way to the chaos of 1968. The certainties of the 1950s had been challenged and often overturned. The decade gave America the space race, with Neil Armstrong walking on the moon in July 1969. It gave America music that still defines popular culture. It gave America a reckoning with race and justice that continues today. It gave America questions about authority and conformity that young people had never asked so loudly before. For families who lived through the 1960s, memories are complicated. There were Sunday dinners and summer vacations, new televisions, and family road trips. There were also arguments at the dinner table, worry about sons in Vietnam, and the shock of watching tragedy unfold on television. The American family of the 1960s was changing, even as it tried to maintain traditions. Women were beginning to question roles that had seemed fixed. Young people were challenging assumptions their parents had never questioned. The world that seemed so stable at the decade's beginning looked very different by its end. For those with memories of this remarkable era, there is always more history to explore.